My guest today is George Monbiot. He's a columnist for the UK's Guardian and was a BBC radio producer and winner of the United Nations Global 500 Award for Outstanding Environmental Achievement. He's the author of numerous books, including Feral, Searching for Enchantment on the Frontiers of Rewilding, and his newest book, just out, is Out of the Wreckage and New Politics for an Age of Crisis. His website is monbiot.com. Did I say that right? Monbiot?
Monbiot.
Monbiot. Okay. So welcome to the show. Great to have you here.
Thanks so much, Rob. It's a real pleasure.
So the book is Out of the Wreckage, and this is a great book. It's really, it pushes so many of my buttons that I love it. You start off talking about story and that we need to change the story and that you need a story to make change happen. And you come up with the narrative that we're dealing with, and it's really not a change in the narrative, it's a change in the story that goes with the narrative. And I love story. I ran a conference on story for 6 years.
Right.
Fantastic. Yeah, and so I'm fascinated with the whole thing about story. So, but I want to kind of do this backwards.
Right. Okay.
So first off, having said what I've said as a kind of preface so far, what do you want this book to accomplish?
Well, I feel that we're at a moment of great danger and great opportunity. We've seen the sort of playing out of the crisis that really began in 2008. It's taken a long time for all the rupture that has caused to really coalesce into this sort of great chasm between people and politics, chasm in the middle of economics, a chasm through society. And what we've got now that we didn't have before is the recognition that the existing system is bust, that it is not working, it's not working for people, it's not working for the living world, it's not sustainable in any sense at all, and it's almost destined to lead to resurgent fascism. And so we desperately need to grasp this opportunity basically before the fascists do, because we see the growth of this very dark response to crisis of the kind that we saw in the 1930s. And the only way to stop that from happening is to produce a better and more compelling narrative of change ourselves before the other side does, before the fascists do. And this really was sort of what went wrong before, that, unless you can show people a better future and a way of reconnecting and a sense of belonging and a sense of having control over their lives, then you'll get all sorts of buckets on broomsticks standing up and saying, we can give you the answer, we got the answer. And it doesn't matter what they say, they'll make false promises, but the answer is basically crushing other people. And we will become dominant and we will crush those other people. And in doing so, we will solve the problems that afflict our lives. And so what I'm trying to do here is to provide a peaceful and generous and inclusive solution to the crisis that we face.
And give us a thumbnail sketch of what that is, and then we'll get into the details and go on.
Sure. Well, the book begins with the observation that you cannot take away someone's story without giving them a new one. And the reason that we're stuck with this broken model, which has caused so many crises, from the financial crisis to the environmental crisis to the political crisis, this model of neoliberalism, of market fundamentalism, is that we have not produced a sufficiently compelling new story with which to replace it. And if you just try to confront a story with facts and figures, all you get is reactive denial, because we are creatures of narrative. We confront a world which is phenomenally complex. We can't understand it by trying to make sense of all the facts and figures. We understand it by looking for a story that makes sense to us.
I mentioned before we started, I ran a conference on story for 6 years. And the first time a Brit came to the conference, a storyteller, and he told a story about how truth went into a city and people threw garbage at him and trash, and they kicked him out. and he was miserable. He went to another city and they did the same thing. And he's sitting outside the city, and Story came along, resplendent in a beautiful robe and smiling and happy. And Story went into the city and everybody greeted him and loved him. And he came back out and said the truth. What's the matter? He goes, nobody likes me. They hate me. So he says, come with me. And he walked into the town, and when truth went with Story, people embraced him and loved him. And I think that's what you're saying, really.
Yeah, exactly. That's a beautiful way of putting it. It's a beautiful way of putting it, and that rings true to me. And you know, you just told a story about a story. You know, and it comes across, it jumps out at you far more than if you just describe what the story is. You know, because telling a story, you've immediately engaged our minds, and that is the power of narrative. And what I've noticed is that it's not just that you know, and this is well known. It's not just that we are prepared to hear stories and we're constantly looking out for them, but there are particular stories which we listen for. And in politics and in religion, the most successful stories all have basically the same format, which is what I call the restoration story. Disorder afflicts the land, caused by nefarious and powerful forces acting against the good of humanity. The hero of the story, who may be one person, maybe a group of people, maybe an institution, confronts those powerful and nefarious forces against the odds, overthrows them, and restores order to the land. Now that is the successful story which has worked again and again and again over centuries. And yet, you know, and this isn't hard to see. You know, this is a sort of fundamental truth about politics, but also about successful religious revolutions. And yet, here we are confronting this very powerful, virulent story of neoliberalism by saying, well, that's not entirely true, you know, because I've got the following facts and figures, and I looked up this paper in Geophysical Research Letters, and it says the following. And we just get nowhere at all with that. It's hopeless. And just as bad is where we say, well, there's this issue we've got to deal with, and that issue we've got to deal with, and we are herring around chasing after all those individual issues without any overarching narrative framework within which to place them.
Well, as I mentioned, I really got into story, and one of the things that I learned early on is that what the preacher taught. First, tell them what I'm going to say, then say it, and tell them what you said. What I really want you to get to is your solution.
Yeah, sure.
We're going to get into depth into neoliberalism and the stories, but between the middle and the end of the book, you get into how to deal with it. And we're talking about the commons, we're talking about community and relocalization, and belonging and the politics of belonging. So I want you to put it out up front so that we can have that in our minds as we're talking about going through the rest of it.
Sure. So I'll tell the basic structure of the story, the new restoration story, and then we can fit that other stuff in as we go along.
Great.
So the story goes like this, that over the past 20 years, there's been an amazing convergence of findings in all sorts of different disciplines, in psychology, in neuroscience, in anthropology, and evolutionary biology. And they all point to the same result, that humankind, by comparison to any other species, is spectacularly altruistic. We're way out there, beyond the end of the spectrum of the rest of the animal kingdom. We don't see it like this because our minds are attuned to danger. We see the bad stuff that human beings do, but we don't see the good stuff that human beings do. But every day, we commit countless acts of economically irrational altruism, little things and big things. And that is the standard way in which humans behave. The psychopaths among us, who are sort of 1% of the population, who unfortunately tend to dominate, and your current president is a good example of that, they do not share those values. The basic human values are shared by 99% of the population. And they are altruism, empathy, kindness, community feeling, benevolence. We are an extraordinary species. But that good nature has been thwarted by powerful and nefarious forces who are the neoliberal group of economists and politicians and journalists who have done everything they possibly can to push selfishness and greed to the front of our minds and to tell us not only that we are inherently above all other characteristics, selfish, greedy, intensely competitive, intensely individualistic. There's no science behind this at all.
So I'm not getting you to give the end of the story, but that's okay. I want to get into neoliberalism anyway. What you say in the book about neoliberalism, I knew a lot about neoliberalism already, but what you did a nice job on putting the history together. And, you know, you basically described the roots as being Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises. Now, those are the gods of libertarians here in this country. And what you describe, they believe in, and they led to Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics, who is one of the evil people on this planet who I frequently refer to. But what you describe them as believing in is horrific and monstrous, really. The idea that democracy is not so good, that people who inherit money are really great, and that that we should value them because they have the freedom of time. I mean, it's insane. I mean, tell us a little bit more about the absolute worst, lowest parts of neoliberalism, because people, and one of the things you also mentioned, just to be brief, and I'll hand it back to you, is it's a secret. Neoliberalism is a secret, which please talk about that as well. First, the evils of it, and then the secret.
Sure. Okay. So the description that you were coming up with really is a condensed version of Friedrich Hayek's book, The Constitution of Liberty. And in this book, he describes very rich people, regardless of how they made that money. If they inherited it, it doesn't matter. The very rich people are the pioneers, the scouts who blaze the trails that the rest of us should follow. Nothing should be allowed to interfere with that role. So they should be subject to almost no tax, to no regulation, to no democratic constraints. They should be able to behave exactly as they want. And the more extreme their behavior, the better the trail that they will blaze for the rest of us to follow. And while their freedom, which is our captivity, while their freedom must be absolute, democracy, I quote, is not an absolute or ultimate value. In other words, that is subordinate to the absolute freedom of the very rich. And their freedom translates into our loss of freedom. So if they are free from all forms of regulation, from all forms of public protection for the rest of us, we find, oh, look, our rivers have been polluted, our buildings are burning down with us inside them, our workers are having their arms pulled off by industrial machinery, the consumers are being poisoned by the stuff in the products that they're eating. There's so many ways in which their freedom translates into our captivity. And freedom isn't a neutral thing. There's some certain freedoms which are neutral. There's certain freedoms which are zero-sum gains. But the great majority of them, so one person's freedom will remove freedoms from other people. And what you must seek is a balance of freedoms. But there is no balance of freedoms in the Constitution of Liberty. It says the freedom should all accrue to the very rich, which means no freedom basically for anyone else. And this book, I mean, it's utterly mad. I mean, it really is completely raging bonkers, as we say in the United Kingdom. For instance, it says everything should be treated as capital on an equal basis. So soil, for example, should just be treated as a commodity which can be traded for any other kind of capital. And if you just strip all the soil off your land while making as much money as quickly as you possibly can, and then use that money to buy something else, some industrial machinery or something, that's fine. There's no problem with that at all. It doesn't specify what happens when everybody strips their soil off the land, which unfortunately is what's happening at the moment. And according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, we have 60 years of soil left in the world. I hope I don't need to explain the...
I'm sure that there's a whole list of different...
Anyway, this is a book. This is a book that
commodities that we're running out of. I'm sure that, and the reality is, neoliberalism is an extractive system as compared to generative. That is basically strip mining humanity and the planet. So I want to just bounce back a little bit. So neoliberals include Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Jimmy Carter, Margaret Thatcher, Blair,
Yeah.
and then there's
So
Bernie.
let's just roll this back a bit. Because, I mean, already in this conversation, we've used three different terms for it. We said neoliberalism, I've said market fundamentalism, you've said libertarianism, other people say Thatcherism or Reaganism or monetarism. And it has so many names because it has gone to great lengths not to be recognized and not to be defined. Mm. And when we say neoliberalism, those who defend the system say, oh, you're conspiracy theorists, there's no such thing, you've just invented this insult. Well, this is a term which was originally used by Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises and Milton Friedman and the rest. They called themselves neoliberals. They invented this term. But in common with all hegemonic systems, which are both hegemonic and secretive, it becomes so big that we're unable to see it. And it becomes universalized, it becomes internalized, and then we then reproduce it in our own lives and our own thinking and our own speech without even being aware that we're doing so.
Give the elevator pitch description of neoliberalism. For what if somebody wanted to describe neoliberalism, they're just learning about it and they want to be able to tell their friend about it, what would you tell them is the brief way to
So neoliberalism conceives human society as basically being a market. And it's a market which determines who the winners are and who the losers are. And that government should not seek to change those social outcomes. Whoever comes out on top deserves, in this sort of social Darwinist framing, to come out on top. And whoever comes out at the bottom deserves to come out on the bottom. And if you don't have a job, if you don't have an income, that's your fault. Structural issues like mass unemployment or the closing down of the industries in your town or whatever, that's got nothing to do with it. You are unemployed because you are lazy and feckless and you just want to suck the teat of the state.
You've used two terms. You've described it as extreme individualism and extreme competition as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. And the idea is that those are the mechanisms by which this market society proceeds. And through the extreme competition and individualism, certain people are going to come to the top and become extremely wealthy, and their wealth is going to trickle down and enrich everyone, so it's going to be good for all of us. That's the story. But inequality is a good thing under neoliberalism, because that allows the rich the total freedom to blaze those trails and to do what they want, and the richer they become, apparently the richer all the rest of us become, despite the fact that it's creating massive inequality. Nothing should be allowed to interfere with them. There should be, trade unions should be basically stamped out. Taxes on the rich should be stamped out to the greatest extent possible. All public protections should be removed, which possibly can be, in order to grant them that freedom. And if this sounds like a self-serving racket, that is because it's a self-serving racket. Now,
okay, but so we need to take a little break. This just a little ID. This is the Rob Kall Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com, on Pacifica Radio, on Progressive Radio Network, on iTunes, at opednews.com/podcasts. And you're listening to George Monbiot, who's got a new book out of the Wreckage, A New Politics for an Age of Crisis. And we've been talking about neoliberalism. So, but neoliberalism in your book you describe as coming into full power in the 1970s because Keynesianism, which is kind of social democracy, collapsed after having been the dominant economic model since the Depression. So talk about a little bit about the Keynesianism and that model and why it collapsed and why neoliberalism took over, and I guess tie in how the story's changed.
Sure. Okay, well, let's look at them both as stories. And the interesting thing about them is that while they are starkly opposed to each other and basically are the sort of the two great conflicting models of the past 70 years, they have exactly the same narrative structure. This is interesting. So the Keynesian social democratic model tells its story as follows. It says the land was thrown into disorder by the nefarious activities of a powerful economic elite who, through their laissez-faire ideology in the 19th and early 20th century, basically grabbed all the wealth of society for themselves, and grabbed tremendous political power and beggared very large numbers of people with disastrous consequences for those people. And the state, by remaining out of the frame, was unable to change those outcomes at all. The crises caused by that culminated in the Great Depression, which basically broke society and broke the prospects of the world's people, many of the world's people. But the hero of the story is the enabling state, supported by working class and middle class people. And this state will create a strong society through building robust public services and a rigorous social safety net so that no one falls to their death, everyone is looked after, and in spending money into the economy to build those public services and that social safety net, it circulates the income, which then generates jobs, which then generate more income, which then increases and sustains economic growth and restores order to the land. So it's a classic restoration story. The neoliberal story says the land was thrown into disorder by the nefarious activities of the overpowerful state, the collectivizing state, which even in its apparently benign forms like the US New Deal or the British welfare state will inevitably take us to totalitarianism. This is why Hayek called his first famous book, The Road to Serfdom. And he says that even the New Deal was on a spectrum with Nazism and Stalinism. It was because it crushes individualism, it crushes opportunity and freedom by sort of interfering with the natural hierarchy of winners and losers, and therefore throws the land into disorder and will lead to dictatorship. But the hero of the story is the entrepreneur, the free market business person who, by creating space within the market through buying and selling, confronts those nefarious and powerful forces of the state and restores order in the form of the free market society in which individualism and freedom and opportunity will be returned, therefore bringing order back to the land. And the interesting thing in both cases is that, hate each other as they might, it is the same narrative arc. And the reason for that is it's a basic narrative arc which works in politics again and again.
And now I've been very into the Joseph Campbell's hero's journeys. And there's a lot of archetypal connection to the hero's journey, and it applies across cultures. Are there archetypes that are associated with this?
Well, look, I'm not an expert. I mean, I read Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces, but years ago. So I don't think I'm qualified to talk about.
I'm going to dig it up and I'll get back to you on it then. But okay. I have a feeling, because you're right, it is so powerful and it is such a central political element that there probably are archetypes associated with it.
Yeah, no, I'm sure there are, but I would have to know more about it than I do in order to stick. But wait, the other question I had was, why did the story change in the 70s? Yeah. Why did the Keynesian switch to the neoliberal? What happened there? Sure. So there were two reasons. First of all, Keynesianism ran into crisis. A number of crises. Some were sort of internal, endogenous crises like cost-push inflation and stagflation. Others were imposed on it basically by this sort of long-term assault by global finance on the model, pulling down capital controls, pulling down fixed foreign exchange rates, thwarting the attempts to create a balanced global trading system through Keynes's proposed international clearing union, and basically vitiated the model. And so it was already running into major trouble. But the neoliberals have been working for 30 years on creating a new narrative. And they created a sort of international. They've built up with massive bequests from billionaires, a network of think tanks, of academic departments, of journalists, of government advisors who had refined the story through this Mont Pelerin society that they'd created. Which
The what kind of society?
It was called the Mont Pelerin Society, founded by Friedrich Kall in 1947, 70 years ago. And so they spent 70 years. They were really clever. You know, they did it with great panache, with great skill. And Friedman himself said, you know, we knew that we weren't going to get anywhere at the height of Keynesianism. Everybody was a Keynesian. You know, Richard Nixon is alleged to have said we're all Keynesians now, because the story, it's not parties or political leaders who run the world, it's powerful political stories. And when you tell the right story, it infects the minds of people across the political spectrum, and everybody accepts it as a common sense. And in the 1950s and 1960s, everyone accepted Keynesianism as common sense. And Friedman said, we'll just wait. It's going to get into trouble. There's going to be crises. And he was quite uncanny in his predictions of when and how that crisis would strike. And he said, and when the time comes, we're just going to move in. And that's what they did. And they came along and said, hey, look, it's all right. We've got a new story. Take this. And the government said, oh, thank goodness, there's a new story. We'll have it. Thank you. Now, the difference between that and what happened in 2008, when the neoliberal story hit the rocks even more spectacularly than the Keynesian story did in the late 1970s, was there was no story with which to replace it. You know, here was this wide open opportunity, just waiting for someone to come along and say, okay, the old story has failed. Here's the new story with which we replace it. Instead, people said, oh, right, okay, that's fallen apart. What do we do? Either we double down on neoliberalism, or maybe we try and dig up some Keynesianism from before.
And well, so really, what you're trying to do with this book is you're trying to generate that story and create a vision of it. And that's a really big deal.
Yeah. It's a highly ambitious attempt. But you know, I'm not alone here. I mean, I've built this on the basis of some fantastic work of lots of different people. And what I hope is that people will refine what I'm doing and build on what I'm doing. And together we're going to do this, because all the best things in life are done together. And I think the age of the sort of the grand persona stroking his beard and writing his manifesto, which alone is going to change the world, that age is over. You know, we've got to do these things together. So what I'm doing here is saying, look, here's a template. Here's a framework of thought that we can start to apply. It's not the end of it. You know, I've laid down some lines here, and I've filled in a few of the colours within those lines, but there's a lot more to be done. And maybe the lines aren't exactly in the right place. Maybe you can help me get them in sort of slightly better aligned. You know, so what I'm trying to do is to tell a new grand narrative, as big, as sweeping, as comprehensive as but either Keynesianism or neoliberalism. And because that is the only thing which is going to bump us out of this crisis and into the new era that we need to move into.
Now, in your in beginning chapters, you talk about how for a political story to work, and you're saying that any of these political stories are restoration stories. So for a new restoration narrative to work, it has to be built on principles.
Yes. Well, it has to be built on values, which then build principles, and we then use those principles to inform the story.
And that's not happening.
No, it's not happening. I mean, at the moment, you know, so if I could just sort of describe these three different things at work here. The values are the bedrock of any person's politics. And a value is generally something you can describe with a single word. And it is, and your values are the qualities which you push forward most as being the things that are most important. So, for instance, your values might be composed of strength, resilience, courage, or they might be composed of wisdom, or of empathy, or a benevolence. But one of the extraordinary things about our movements is we haven't identified the values which underpin them. We haven't said to ourselves, okay, what are our values? Let's list them and let's be able to describe them without embarrassment. So that's your bedrock, is your values. And I think the values which should underpin our movement are altruism, empathy, community feeling, self-acceptance, kindness towards others. So those should be the bedrock values, so that we can always refer back to those and say, are we living by our values? Do our principles reflect our values? Does our story reflect our values? So the principles then are the soil derived from the bedrock. And the principles are the basic and unchanging notions on the grounds of which we want to run society. So we might say, we want to live in a world in which everyone has access to good education throughout their lives. That's a principle. And it's a principle which can arise from the basic values that we have. We want to live in a world in which the needs of everyone are met without exceeding the carrying capacity of the living planet and therefore destroying our lives. That's another principle.
Sustainable.
So, was that? Sustainable. Yeah, exactly. I mean, a value can be sustainability, whatever that means. It's a bit of a woolly word, so I tend not to use it. But you can say, okay, my value is sustainability. So a principle arising from that value is that everything we do should operate within the environmental limits of the natural world. So that's value translated into principle. So we should also be able to list our principles, to name them, to be able to explain them without hesitation or embarrassment. But the values.
You've got a great list in the beginning of the book.
Yeah, so I've listed about 16 or 17 basic. Do you want me to read one or two of them to you?
Sure.
Sure. I mean, maybe I should have memorized them. But we want to live in a place guided by empathy, respect, justice, generosity, courage, fun, and love. So in this case, it's a principle which is overtly mentioning values. Number 2, we want to live in a place governed by judgments that are honestly made, supported by evidence, accountable and transparent. Number 3, we want to live in a place in which everyone's needs are met without harming the living world or the prosperity of future generations. And it goes on like that. So there's 16 of them. And so basically what those principles do is to describe the world in which we want to live. That's the promised land we're trying to reach. But the principles themselves are not the story. The values are not the story. The story should reflect those principles and those values. It can't incorporate all of them because it would be a very clunky story if it tried to overtly incorporate all of them. But it should create the overarching narrative framework into which the values and principles are embedded and can easily be brought forward. So the story is that basic framework of the restoration story. And the way I tell it is, we're this spectacularly altruistic species. Our capacity, our good nature, our capacity for altruism and kindness towards others has been thwarted by this ideology which puts selfishness and greed first, to the extent that we start to internalize that, to believe that, and to behave like that. But we, the heroes of the story, are going to restore our good nature, not change human nature, reveal human nature, reveal ourselves for the really amazing creatures that we are, by rebuilding community from the bottom up. We're going to do this by creating real communities with real power, communities with real resources at their disposal, communities which are not community in name, but community in action. And building those communities, we rebuild a generous, inclusive politics, which allows us to express our better nature. We at the same time must change governments and ensure, we've got some clever strategies for doing this now, that we get governments that reflect that as well. But in creating this, in restoring our good nature, we restore all those fundamental principles that we want to see: equitable economies, living within the means of the living planet, everybody treated with respect and dignity. All of those fundamental principles can then be applied once we restore the amazing thing that is human nature.
And I'm always bringing up one of my favorite researchers, and Darshan Narvaez wrote a book about the neurobiology of the development of human morals. And what she basically said is that before civilization, humans are all the things you described. And when they were living in small hunter-gatherer bands, even before tribes. And there are hundreds of different genetic elements that are part of making us those incredibly altruistic beings.
Yeah.
But then civilization came along, and domination of and domestication of animals, and ownership of land, and domination of people, and ownership of people, and that really blocked all these elements of being the altruistic, wonderful humans we are. And you use the word return. And so, the fact is there's a lot of research that shows that our neurobiology is built for that, but a lot of it is repressed. And
yes, that's so true.
And I agree with you that community is, and going back to local, going away from centralization is the way to do it.
And the thing that makes sense of community, and this is crucial to it all, I mean, one of the grand mistakes that almost everyone has been making is that we position ourselves politically along a linear scale. We say, right, there's a state at one end of the scale, there's a market at the other end of the scale. How much state do you want? How much market do you want? If you want a lot of state, you're on the left. If you want a lot of market, you're on the right. And that's how we define ourselves politically. And that seems to make sense, except for an inconvenient fact that there are four sectors to the economy. There's the state, there's the market, there's the household, and there's the commons. But we only ever talk about the state and the market. Now, the result of only ever talking about the state and the market is that, number one, the household, which is the core economy, and without the household, there would be no economy, because children wouldn't go to school, and they wouldn't be fed, and they wouldn't be loved, and they would be incapable of being functional adults. That means that when that is disregarded, women's work is disregarded, because women still do most of that work, and it's unrewarded, and women are basically just seen as almost invisible in the economy. In fact, there's a wonderful book by Catherine Marcel called Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner? And it describes how, while he was writing The Wealth of Nations, the invisible hands of his mother were doing all the work. And he couldn't have written The Wealth of Nations without the invisible hands of his mother, but he didn't acknowledge it at all. She just didn't exist. And the whole household economy did not exist as an economic driver in his worldview. So that's the household, the sort of third sector of the economy. But then there's the commons. And the commons is so neglected that you have to explain to people what it is, because people have never heard of it and they can't define it. And I go to meetings of really so smart politics students or economic students and say, hands up, who knows what the commons is? One or two hands would go up out of a room of 400 people. It's an extraordinary thing. And yet it's one of the four sectors of the economy. So a commons is a resource which is controlled and managed by a community for the benefit of that community, through a set of rules and negotiations which decide how that source can be sustained in perpetuity, and how the benefits can be shared on an equitable basis among its members. It's a non-capitalist economy in its true form. It's based on, sorry?
I want to throw in a little bit more. You've written a book. You've done a lot of work with indigenous people. I know you've spent time in Papua New Guinea. And when you talk about the commons and all these rules for shared ownership, ownership itself is a concept that we have kind of taken to an extreme. And in indigenous cultures, that ownership doesn't even exist. And so I'm just putting that on the table, that ownership is an option.
Sure. So I use the words controlled and managed. You could also say stewarded or you could call it guardianship. But the word ownership, you're quite right, is not the right word. So And the idea that you own the land, for example, is just completely alien to most indigenous people. I mean, this was an idea which only really took root in the 16th century in England. It's a very recent idea, and then was spread when, you know, landowners, the people who said that they owned the land, started grabbing it from everybody else.
Do you know the history? You know the history of the beginning of land ownership that you just said started in the 1800s?
There's a great book. There's a great book called Owning the Earth by Andrew Linklater, which discusses this. It's really fascinating. There's another one called This Land is Our Land by Marion Short. And they both give really powerful descriptions of what happened. So, and it started in England, which is interesting from my point of view because I live in England. And then the model was spread to Ireland and to Scotland, and basically millions of people were dispossessed. Their land was grabbed. The big landlord said, "This is now ours. You're off. No trespassing signs. Anyone comes back, you're going to get beaten up or you're going to get killed. So clear off into the slums where you belong." And what happened in those circumstances was that everything fell apart. Community was ripped apart. These very rich communities with their ceremonial lives, with their festivals, with all working together, a very rich community culture was just completely destroyed. And people were scattered to the four winds. Many people died of starvation. Many were arrested for vagrancy, branded for vagrancy. Some people were transported. Many people transported themselves by migrating to the Americas or to Australia or elsewhere. The consequences were devastating. And then England took that model and exported it to the colonies. And all over the world, we started doing this to indigenous people, completely destroying their lives. And now I began to become aware of this, working in West Papua and in Brazil and in East Africa, and seeing the devastating consequences for indigenous people of losing their land, of this enclosure that was taking place, and seeing the alienation, the anomie, the alcoholism, the drug abuse, the complete collapse that was taking place.
Well, alcoholism and drug abuse, they're parts of the tools of colonizers.
Absolutely, absolutely. But that it's very easy to sort of push people into that despair. You know, once they've lost their land, despair is your dominating characteristic. And so you just grab onto anything and say, "Oh yeah, hey, have some alcohol, make you feel better. And then we won't have to have any trouble from you ever again." And then I came back to Britain and I started reading the poems of John Clare, who is this amazing 19th century poet who was a peasant. He was a peasant living in a community, working the land, and he wrote this beautiful nature poetry and beautiful poetry about the people he worked with, and he created this a magical world through his words. And then enclosure came along. The landlords came along, enclosed the land with fences, kicked everyone off, and John Clare became an alcoholic, went mad, and ended up in a lunatic asylum. And his poems described that decline. And it suddenly struck me, my God, this is what's happened to all of us. We are all victims of this, and we're just a couple of hundred years down the line. We're not seeing it because of that. Why do we have alcoholism and drug addiction and despair and so many of these social diseases? It's because of the destruction of our commons, the alienation, the anomie.
And, you know, I've been working on my book Bottom Up, and I did an interview a while back with an anti-psychiatry psychiatrist, Bonnie Burstow, and you know, she's really against psychiatric drugs, and she basically says that any psychiatric drug is going to do damage to your brain. And the research is there are places that don't use psychiatric drugs, and the alternative is community. Yeah. So what you're describing is what drives people to psychiatric drugs, and the psychiatric drugs are the way to maintain people out of the asylum because the environment is so toxic.
Yeah. It's another form of control as well, because
Absolutely.
Instead of saying to people, okay, we're giving control back to you because we're going to allow you to rebuild community, and you're going to be able to rebuild it on a meaningful basis because we're going to give you your resources back. You say, no, we're going to just keep you drugged and keep you down and keep you treating this as an individual problem as if it's a problem from entirely within your own mind that this has come from, rather than as a social problem, as a social crisis, which is what it is. And it's much bigger than you. This problem you've got, which you might call depression, or you might call social phobia or anxiety disorder or self-harm or whatever it might be, actually is not just your problem, it's our problem. This is a social problem. It's caused by the breakdown of society. It's caused by the theft of our fundamental resources, and one of those resources is community, which is built on those fundamental resources. And so what I'm saying is that if we're to bring back real community, then we have to bring back the commons which make sense of community. For a community to actually be able to function, it has to have resources, genuine resources like land or water or other means by which you can make your living from the stuff that's around you. Things which have currently been captured by corporations, and they've put great sort of intellectual property rights in front of it, like a no trespassing sign, and say you can't come here because this is now ours. In doing so, they make it impossible for community to function, and basically they've stolen our stuff. Those are our resources. And when you have the resources and you have the power to use them freely, and you have the power to ensure that people can share on an equitable basis, then community can start to function once more. But otherwise, it's on fragile foundations.
So what are the first steps to regaining the commons and building community?
So let me give you one example of what could be done. Let's take an urban borough. And it could be anywhere in any big city. And at the moment, people are basically paying a lot of rent to people who aren't working or don't have to work. So you work all day long in order to give half that money to someone who's just sitting on a piece of land with the building on top of it saying, right, I'll sit here like a fish in the current and I'm going to take it all in, give me the rent. We have almost no control about what happens on that land. They come along and say, hey, we're going to do a regeneration project. And oh dear, it involves social cleansing. So all of you off, and we're going to build some grand condo complex for the rich or whatever it might be. So let's do something about that. Why is the land so expensive? Why are people making so much money from it? Because it's not properly taxed. So you bring in land value taxation, proper high level of land value taxation for the most valuable property, which is basically trying to return some money to the community.
What you're saying is people don't own land.
No, well, people, listen, no one invented the land. No one created the land. People claim to own land, and technically, legally, they do own land. I'm saying they shouldn't own land, and I'm proposing a solution for how we might address this. So, first of all, you bring in the tax. The government, local government should take some of it to pay for public services, but the residue goes to the community. And then the community, alongside that tax, gets a right to buy. Whenever land comes up for sale, it has the first right to buy that land. And it's got a pot of money with which to buy it. Oh, and by the way, the price of the land has come down because the land value tax has reduced the value of that land to a private owner. He can't make so much money of it, so the price comes right down. It's a lot easier to buy. The community can then start buying the land around it. And it says, right, what are we going to do with this land? Oh, we're going to use it to meet our needs, not the needs of some offshore property developer who's going to just try and make as much money as possible. Let's look at what our needs are. Maybe our most pressing need is for properly affordable housing. So let's create a housing estate here, and an estate which is planned by the people who are going to live in it. Here are some people who don't have any housing who are within the borough. Some of those are going to live in that estate. We're going to mix it up with people who are going to be able to buy houses. You put down a deposit. You too have a right to plan this estate. You lot, we're going to bring you all together. You're going to sit down. You're going to work out, how do you want this estate to be? Do you want it to look like one of those big developers' estates, or do you want it to look like your home? And already, before you even build the thing, you have to start creating community, because people have to work together in planning and designing that estate that they're going to live on.
Now, you say in the book that there's a percentage of people in a community who need to come together to kind of make a critical mass happen. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so there's this. This is a slightly different thing, but it ties in. Where if you try to create what's called a participatory culture, which is as many people involved in community projects as possible. To really get it going, you have to have a mixture of projects. Some are sort of quite sort of involving and quite high commitment, but others have to be very low entry and low commitment. You know, every couple of weeks, not necessarily even on a regular basis, drop in and do a bit of cooking with some people. You know, learn a few cooking skills, share some food. It'd be a lot cheaper. You get better food for less cost than if you do it by yourself. Or we'll share some childcare, or we'll mend some clothes together, or learn how to mend your kettle. You know, the various, you know, so low commitment activities which almost anyone can join. Now,
and I need to do with an ID, a show ID, and then we'll come back to what's already going on, because there's a lot already going on. This is Rob Kall, Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com. It's available on Pacifica Radio and Progressive Radio Network and iTunes and Stitcher, and at opednews.com/podcasts. And my guest is George Monbiot. He's a columnist for the UK's Guardian and was a BBC radio producer, and he's got a new book out of the Wreckage, A New Politics for an Age of Crisis. So you've talked about how we need to get local community people engaged. And the reality is there's an awful lot of that going on. Gar Alperovitz talks about how there are like 120 million Americans already in some aspect of some kind of a worker co-op or local investment organizations. There are land trusts that are already doing the buying back of land and things like that. So you're not talking about something that we have to start from scratch. This
Absolutely
is already
not.
up and going, billions of dollars already happening.
Absolutely right. No, absolutely. And the thing is now, what the academic research seems to show is that once you get about 10 to 15% of people in the community involved in these things, you get a sudden inflection point. Then
ding, ding, ding.
Was that?
Ding, ding, ding.
Ding, ding, ding. That's right. Suddenly it's like, oh, wait a minute. That's the normal thing to do, being involved in a community project. That's the norm. Why aren't I involved? And you suddenly feel weird if you're not involved in a community project, rather than, as you often do at the moment, weird if you are involved in a community project. And then it just becomes utterly natural. Oh yeah, no, let's see what's in my neighborhood. And oh, look, these are quite cool folks doing some pretty amazing stuff. You know, they're building a skate park. You know, I want to be involved in a skate park. You know, I want a skate park. I want to skate. You know, whatever it might be, there's there's going to be something which is going to chime with you. And you're going to feel left out unless you're involved in this. And that sort of 10 to 15% penetration seems to just flip the whole feeling of being in a place. And the classic example of how things can happen is in Rotterdam, where in, I think it was 2011, there was a project started called the Leeszaal, the reading room, in a disused Turkish bathhouse. And they said, look, we've got this good space. Let's make it in a bit of a hangout center, have a few books, some newspapers, some computers, tea, coffee, a little bit of food perhaps, and we'll just see what happens. You know, they did it as part of a festival initially, and a lot of people came. And it's just a great place to meet people. There were a few talks, there were films, there was sort of interesting stuff going on. They got a lot of volunteers, people from 17 different countries of origin, aged from 10 to 81, I think. And they and things began to take off. And they thought, oh, well, hey, look, we can make this a permanent thing. Let's put in a bar. Let's put in another cafe. And then the people doing the cafe said, oh, this cafe is working well. Let's set up a second cafe. And so it's founded 1,300 community projects. It has transformed the city. Maybe, you know, it's one thing. It's like the butterfly's wing, you know, it's like, poof. It has turned the whole thing around. And Rotterdam is now a great communal city in which to live because of this one project.
How do they pay for it?
Well, you know, it's in the first instance, you're talking very little money, you know. So something like that, you know, so at the beginning, they say, right, we're going to use this space, you know, and basically someone says, okay, use the space for a month, you know, that's fine. And then you start to generate a bit of income. You might get some grants from the local authority. I mean, this stuff needs to start in places where there's a fairly sympathetic local government. You know, if you're in a totally hostile environment, it's going to be much, much harder to get this stuff.
So you're saying that local government needs to invest in it.
Yeah.
And how do you sell that to local government? What do they get out of it?
It is incredibly cost effective because there's all sorts of interventions that local government is making in terms of social care, in terms of dealing with the impacts of so many people on alcohol, on drugs, all the crime that's associated with that, all the care that's required, all the hospitalization that's required. There are so many excluded people who are going to need special government services and all the rest of it. What you find is that with a tiny amount of spending, you are saving millions. I mean, many, many times the amount of money that you're spending, you are saving because suddenly society is functioning and society is doing a lot of the things which government currently has to do if everything's not to go to the dogs.
Well, talk a little bit more about how apply that to this reading room program with all these the fractalization of it, or it recreated itself. Yeah. What do they actually do that is serving and saving that money?
Well, you've got, in any society, in any city, you've got a whole lot of people who are basically excluded, and they're basically people who aren't earning any money. They don't have jobs. They're in the black economy, and they are just about getting by, and they're the people who are often going to be homeless, the people who are going to have major addiction problems, big psychiatric problems, the people who be victims of crime, who might perpetrate crimes, but people who need help from the state. Otherwise, you get a situation of just saying, right, we're barbarians and we don't care, and we're just going to leave people to die on the street. Unless we're going to accept that anyone who falls through the cracks should be left to die on the street, the state has to intervene, and that means money. And what you find with projects like this is that once you begin to develop what the practitioners call a thick network of participatory culture beginning to gel, of all these projects beginning to gel, then suddenly a whole load of people who currently just had no place, no sense of belonging, no sense of being part of society, who had just fallen through the cracks, have social support and have a place to go and have a sense that they belong and have a way of then pulling themselves up off the floor, getting themselves into work, getting themselves help, talking to other people. As you say, being part of community is a far more effective treatment than any amount of drugs. And you suddenly find that you, the government, and it shouldn't be about money, but if you want to sell it to them, this is the way to sell it to them. You are spending loads less. In fact, there's a figure in here. If I can, I can't remember it off the top of my head, and I don't want to get it wrong. But there's an amazing one of the London boroughs, the London borough of Lambeth, did a study on this and worked out how much the saving was, and it's quite spectacular. Let me just. So, yeah, here we go. So building, right, to reach a threshold at which participatory culture starts to rule through the community, generating benefits even for those who aren't directly engaged, the shift's likely to need help from the municipality. And it's highly cost effective. So
you're breaking up a little bit. Our internet connection is a little unstable. Can you repeat that again?
Yeah, sure. So the study says that that this help is highly cost effective. Supporting a thick participatory culture costs around £400,000, about $500,000 for 50,000 residents. That's roughly 0.1% of local public spending. And it's likely to pay for itself many times over by reducing the need for mental health provision and social care, and by suppressing crime rates and recidivism, as well as alcohol and drug dependency.
Okay, so what does that program actually do? What does it provide in terms of space, in terms of services, in terms of interaction?
Sure. Well, I mean, when you look at a situation like this, where you've got 1,300 projects, these are highly diverse projects. One of them might be a basketball court. One of them might be a vegan cafe. One of them might be a library. There's a swimming pool. There's so many different things get kicked off. Because what you do, once you start creating a sense of community, and once people feel that they are heard and that they belong, that leads to an explosion of creativity. This is an amazing thing. You know, I mean, just as we're all kinder people than we think we are, we're all more creative people than we think we are, but our creativity is suppressed by the feeling that nobody cares, nobody's listening. So yeah, if I do a painting, no one's ever going to see it, and if they see it, they'll probably laugh at it, because, you know, we're in this sort of highly individualistic, competitive culture where they say, well, I could do better than that, you know. Whereas if you're in a situation where you feel supported by community, you're painting and people say, yeah, well, there's something in that, maybe you could improve it like this, maybe that, and you get empowered by this. You get empowered by this thought that other people are listening to you and being heard. That's an absolutely fundamental human need, to be heard. And people who are heard themselves start to listen. And so when you've got that culture where people are basically supportive of each other, you lose your shyness about creativity, and you start to think, oh, maybe we could do this. Here's a crazy idea. What about this? And you get all these people with ideas which previously looked crazy, implementing them and finding, hey, they're not so crazy. This is working. Not all of them are going to work, of course, but a lot of them are going to work, and they're going to be all sorts of completely different things, because we're completely different people. You know, we have our different interests, and we're going to develop those interests in different ways.
I know in Chicago, there's a community garden that I've had some contact with, and it has just exploded. And the alderman has helped to fund it and provide some space for it. And then he did another one, and it's just been amazing to see it flower. And you know, they found at one point that the people who spent money to get plots in the garden to pay for some of the materials, they were growing these vegetables. And people, because it was on public land, would come in and take the vegetables, and they were feeling violated, that what they worked for was stolen. And then they came up with this idea that they're going to have an area of the garden that they grow the vegetables for people who want to come and get vegetables. And such a beautiful idea, you know.
So lovely.
And the alderman, this one alderman, is continuing to grow the project, and I think it's really exciting. And you mentioned in the book about how there's a growing element of democratization of funding, where you describe how the people, not just some politicians, decide where the money goes, a percentage of it, even if it's a tiny percent.
Yeah, well, so this is participatory budgeting, and the classic example of this is in the Brazilian city of Porto Alegre, where it began. And there, 20% of the municipal budget, the infrastructure budget, is controlled entirely by the people. And every year, some 50,000 people come together to allocate that budget. And the results have been extraordinarily spectacular. Corruption has been eliminated. Clientelism has been eliminated. Pork barrel projects have been eliminated. The gangs and the mafias have fallen apart because they no longer have any power over people, because they can only operate when people have no alternative, when it's the gangs and the mafias who basically provide people with some of their basic needs. Well, that's gone. And what you see is massively reduced infant mortality, much better sanitation, much better water, much better healthcare, much better education. And so successful as it's been that, check this, people are now lobbying the city government to raise their taxes. They say, please raise our taxes, because they understand the point.
That's a change in the way people think. That is a change in the story, too. So, but we're getting near the end. We've really only got a couple more minutes left. So we need to wrap this up with, pull it together. Pull it together. What is the story? What is the narrative that is going to replace neoliberalism? And how is that going to be a story that people are going to embrace and that'll lead them to ask to raise taxes even?
Yeah. So the narrative is that human nature is a wonderful thing. We are this spectacularly altruistic, empathetic species, but we are prevented from being like that by the circumstances under which we live. Those circumstances made far worse by this virulent ideology of neoliberalism. But we, by coming together to create community, and real community, supported by real power and real resources, rediscover our wonderful human nature and restore everything that is good about people, and begin to act together to confront our common problems. And in doing so, we ensure that we can never be exploited, and trampled in the same way that we are today again.
You know, in doing this show for going on 9 years, one conclusion that I came to is that we need to develop bottom-up connection consciousness. It's a very indigenous way of thinking, where you see how everything around you and you are connected to your people, to the nature, and everything like that. And I think that's part of what you're talking about, really.
Absolutely. There's so much that there are two main influences. I mean, obviously, I've read loads of people. I've been incredibly inspired by a lot of great thinkers, but there are two main things which has fed into this. One, the 6 years I spent working with indigenous people. And the other thing is the album I made with a great musician over here called Ewan McLennan, which was called Breaking the Spell of Loneliness. And we made this album because we were aware that loneliness was this huge social problem causing massive mental and physical health problems. And we toured it around the country, and at every gig, we basically forced people to start talking to each other. And then we took it out of the concert hall and into the nearest bar. We got as many people to come to the bar as possible, and we just got everyone talking. And we found that among the people there were a lot of people who were chronically lonely. There were a lot of people who were trying to do something about loneliness, local community groups, really inspiring ideas they had, doing some great projects, a lot of which we went to see. And we just talked and talked and talked. And out of this, I suddenly began to see, we're not talking about the answer here, we're doing the answer. And people who were lonely and suffering and having enormous social problems, suddenly they weren't having those problems anymore because they'd just met a whole community of kind people who they were then connected with. And suddenly
this is a community who was there all along.
Yeah.
And so part of the process, part of the story is helping people to wake up to that community that's all around them and to that kindness and compassion that's already within them.
Exactly. And it's this process of self-discovery and societal discovery that is going to change the world. And as you say, it's there. We don't have to invent this. People, sometimes say when you come up with a new political program, they say, oh, you want to change human nature. Well, the great thing about this is no. The last thing I want to do is to change human nature. I want to unveil human nature. The neoliberals very successfully changed human nature. That was their overt intention. Margaret Thatcher said at one point, economics is the method, the objective is to change the heart and the soul. She went about quite deliberately to change human nature, to make us more greedy, more grasping, more selfish than we really are. Well, we don't have to do that. We just have to say, right, let's just get all this rubbish out of the way and be the people we really are. And when we're allowed to do that, when our nature is revealed, we will discover that there's someone waiting for us, and someone who's a much better person and a much kinder person than we imagined. And that someone has been there all along.
And we got to wrap it. Stay with me, though, George. Okay, you've been listening to the Rob Kall Show, Bottom Up Show with George Monbiot. His website is monbiot.com, and his book is Out of the Wreckage: A New Politics for an Age of Crisis.